Hi everyone and welcome to Class Discuss. Today I'm very excited to have with me Yeo Siew Hua, who's the director of The Once and Future, as well as Eugene Berman, who is the composer for the production. So I'm just going to jump into it because there's so many things to unpack. But maybe just to begin, if we could talk about the title, The Once and Future. I mean, it's such an evocative, there's such an evocative ring to it. And I was wondering if both of you could speak a bit more to how it came about and what were you thinking when you came up with this title?
In an earlier iteration of this project, when it first came to me, it was put together by the producers, right? Roger, yourself, Eugene, and Topi. And I guess they had come up with an original concept. It was not so fleshed out. It was like a concept, in its more basic form, and they sort of approached me to work with them to create this project, and since then a lot has developed, right? But actually when the project first came to me with this title, there is of course a very important element about the future, about voyages actually, right? About the voyages that we take, as people, and on a larger scale, on a sort of human civilization scale, the voyages that we have taken and also the voyages that we are about to take, right? So I think this idea that we are looking into certain voyages that we are to take in a very near future, right? But how are we taking references and learning from where we are and how we got here to look forward and to prepare ourselves for certain future voyages, which also has certain kind of speculative nature to the work. So this is sort of in its most when the project was presented to me, so this is how it came about with the title. I'm not sure if Eugene, because you started the project even in a sense earlier than me, was there any discussion about how this exact title came about?
Yeah, I mean, it was really Roger Garcia who had the concept, so I'm sort of innocent when it comes to the title. I didn't really participate in this. I think it was really Roger's kind of, I think Chris said it really properly, that it was a bit of an idea and a concept, but not something that was. It could have gone to so many directions, and I think Chris took it into a direction which was really the most interestingly the one that was the most evocative of the title itself, probably. And so you somehow gave the title its meaning, I would say, interestingly enough. And actually the title changed because originally we were talking about the work as The Once and Future Man, and for I may be wrong, but I think Chris, you were the one who cut the man, which I think was really a great kind of contribution to the kind of the universality maybe of this work somehow. But it was interesting that I think Chris's involvement, which really took the concept and gave it meaning and gave it a direction and gave it obviously the film. And I think actually the film ultimately reflects the title somehow more than the title ever contained in itself the kind of the meaning. So the film gave it more meaning, I think, than the English words themselves would have simply allowed. And so but I'm really like I had nothing to do with it, and I'm very happy to have nothing to do with it, because it's in a way it's sort of it was something that defined itself as the project went along, and that's kind of nice.
I think we were always, I mean, I think as a filmmaker, I always deal with certain concept of time, and maybe at first the concept had to do with also sort of a singular character with a certain kind of narrative. But I think we decided to really strip that down. And for me as a filmmaker, I was very interested always with the idea of time. Like even if we were talking about, the humans, as a larger race or species, for me, it's like this moment of us, right? And that futurity of us, and I think that's why we decided at the end to strip away the idea of focusing on just a certain hero character, but to really understand it as this is us in this present moment and in the future, also looking back into the past in some ways.
Yeah, that's really lovely. I think what I'm hearing is that in a way the title wound up becoming a kind of compass for the voyage, right? That I think in other productions where it feels like the exploration is a bit more emergent, that in this case there's a certain concept, and by constantly moving towards that concept, towards thinking about that futurity as you were talking about, then it kind of manifested itself in a new way, and yet in a way that is in keeping with the spirit of the original concept and the original intention. I think when you talk about time and the exploration of time, I'm also very conscious that this project has taken a very long time in unfolding itself, right? And I'm curious about the kind of journeys or the kind of intersections perhaps with other projects that both of you have been doing. I think you're both very prolific artists, and I'm curious about whether there were, in a way, offshoot explorations of the once and future in other projects, or whether you brought things from other projects into the once and future. Maybe Siew Hua, would you like to start first?
Sure. Yeah. For me, I think with all the works that I come up with, even with works that, Roger came to me with in this sense, the once and future, it's hard for me to say like, oh, this is a completely new, it starts from nothing, right? It always is for me a continuation or a continuum of also who I am and where I am at, and so I do see that a lot of my works have a certain link if they are not like some kind of sequels to a something, or a prequel to a something. And I think that there is, firstly, there is a central character who is the Minotaur who will appear in the film. This is a character who has previously also appeared in some of my previous work, particularly a short film called The Minotaur. But also in the Chinese title, it's called Niu Mo Wang, which is a different kind of Minotaur from the Chinese folklore. So, I mean, we can talk a little bit more about this character maybe later, but I just wanted to say that I sort of brought back not just a character, but a certain fixation or obsession about the hybrid creature of the Minotaur, representing many different things for me. And as I had just mentioned that in my previous short film, he was called Niu Mo Wang, which is actually also a cow-headed humanoid, right? So for me, interestingly, like this character of this hybrid creature appears in both, of course, famously the Western Greek myth, but also in the same in the case of our Asian folklore and tales, and which is also quite religious in some sense. The idea of this kind of hybrid creature appearing everywhere. without us even discussing about it between us, meaning, the Occident and, so here we have an obsession that kind of pans all of us. And for me, it's very interesting, this obsession. I would also then say that since then, I had also started to make works, of course, to do a lot with the climate and the ecologies. And I think a lot of that idea sort of came into the Once and Future also. Because in the Once and Future, something that we can also talk a little bit about, there's a lot of exploration about the way we eat meat, basically, yeah? And so I think this part of my exploration started in another kind of short film work that I created called An Invocation to the Earth. And then later on also this other work called The Lover, the Excess, the Ascetic, and the Fool, which has been sort of converted into also an NFT work recently. Yeah, but so these few smaller explorations of what I was looking at, of course, to do with the climate, but importantly to do with spaces also, the forest that we have here, and how that certain spiritual natures come out of these spaces, and all of that sort of got put into a certain strange bag, which has also this story that we probably will get into a little bit, of me arriving in Argentina. And when I take all of that of me brought over to Argentina, finally the Once and Future started to take shape, in a very new way that I myself did not expect, because now I displaced myself in Argentina to develop this work, and something new and quite magical happens, but still with a lot of me and a lot of my previous works that sort of seep into it, sometimes quite subconsciously. I feel like I started making it, and then I realized, wow, there was that. And then there was something else previously that sort of found its way into this work. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm almost thinking about how the way you're talking about the process being for you as quite parallel to the very loose narrative within the Once and Future, right? Where the totality of the human experience or different human experiences are downloaded into this AI figure. And so it's interesting to hear that the making of mirrors, in a way, the narrative within the piece. Eugene, how was it for you? And I'm particularly curious also to think about your work with Arya, and whether that also fed into the way the Once and Future has been, is shaped as an expanded cinema experience.
Yeah, well, I think we can't get away from ourselves in our work anyway, but even when we try to sort of leave behind or something, or try to make a fresh start, we're still cursed a little bit by our own. And I think this is also the brilliant part of creating anything, is that you can never get away from yourself. And the more you try, the more you do something which is you somehow. I think in this case, so of course every piece that I did before, and also everything that I will do in the future, is somehow in this music, probably. And I tend not to self-analyze too much, but of course it's easier after it's done and you hear it or you see it, and then you can sort of say, okay, I think it's maybe a little bit the same process that Chris sees in his work, but in my case, I just somebody has to play the thing first a little bit. but in a way, it was also a bit of a different departure for me because it also comes back to your question about how long something takes. Because actually, uh, depending on different standards, because I think on the standards of let's say opera or some of the kind of projects that I've done before, this was actually not too slow. And if you consider the fact that we were doing this in a very difficult time, I mean, the fact that I think Chris was in Argentina at like the perfect moment, or perfect in quotation marks, when it was possible to film something, because then things were shut down before, after, or whatever. And so we were trying to, during a very complex time in every sense, to create this and to keep this project kind of running forward no matter what. It felt very, it felt like it was just always moving forward a little bit. And of course, there were issues with with pandemic matters all the way through, but at the same time we kind of kept moving this project forward. But for me, like creatively, I think I really tried to also understand what the visuals and the vision that Chris had kind of called for musically, which usually, let's say when I do an opera or some other kind of more conventional stage work in music, one usually does not care what the stage director is looking for. I mean, the stage director makes a prompt and says like, this is the concept, and then you go off and do the thing, and then I would come back with the music, and then they work around that music, and that case with the work I did in Luxembourg earlier this year. And so in this time for me, it was just important to understand, because I mean, first of all, film music, which this is not really at all, works slightly differently, because it's supposed to also have some sort of function within the film, and it's supposed to serve also the visuals, not just itself. So I also just really wanted to understand what Chris was imagining, and so he gave very generously a lot of time to explain. Like, we went scene by scene and sort of try to understand where there's music, where there's not music, and these kinds of things. So that was very new and interesting, and quite. I think it really. We talked a lot about different sort of approaches and symbolisms in the music. The idea of I think we never use this term, but the idea of mosaic, a little bit about these different scenes of different characters somehow fitting in together, and that fed into the music because it's about creating different things that somehow in the end coalesce. But the thing is, they have to coalesce in the beginning. It has to be sort of in the recipe of the cake that all of these things will work together, but the listener doesn't realize until it starts to come together. And in a way, that's the film as well, that you only see the sort of the making of. Your brain will create it at once you get through it. So a lot of that was quite new, and for me, of course, it's very useful, because then it feeds into things that don't relate to this process. So it's more of like a kind of a nice change for I think the future for me as well.
And I did want to pick up on the thread about Aria, because I think that stood out to me as quite a unique production, where it was specifically about bringing music, bringing I guess opera into a kind of expanded experience that wasn't just about sitting in a theater and listening to it, right? Could you share more about that project?
Sure. Well, this also kind of, I think, has to do with two, I don't know if the right word is problems, but two issues that I think both the film world and the music world are dealing with, which is the fact that the concert hall itself is just not it's a very 19th century or early 20th century kind of construct of all of us sitting the same direction, facing this way, and this kind of the idea of stage action being sort of it's one direction kind of thing. And perhaps in film as well, the fact that in general people are you can now watch so many things from your laptop, you don't have to go to the theater. And so I think it's also questioning the theater as a space for where we see things, and how do we give life to the theater still, that like give people a reason to go, but also to sort of review and renew the role of like the stage perhaps. With Arya, it was the case that, which was totally something also that we debuted during like the kind of the worst part of the pandemic in November 2020. And yeah, it was the first project that I did really, which challenged this idea of, you know, where the audience engagement with what they're seeing. And so in this case, it was sort of the dream of like, what if you could see a performance from the set itself, you know, that you could, it's a little bit like Jurassic Park somehow, that, you know, you like, who wants to see dinosaurs when you can walk among them, this kind of idea. And so we tried to create this you know, journey for people to experience something about air and the environment, but actually while they were in that environment. And of course there were a billion logistical problems with that, which is probably why it's not done so often. But it was also very, I think those sorts of explorations, and the one that we're doing here as well, even though this is kind of in a proper theater, but we're still challenging it in many, many ways with the way that the work is presented. And I think this is sort of what will probably be necessary kind of push for multidisciplinary projects, that you know, we can't just take the stage for granted. We have to rethink how we engage with audiences.
That's really beautiful. I think that does feel like a big theme of many of the explorations in SIFA this year, right? Where it's really, what does it mean to engage I wouldn't even say engage, but this idea of what is the relationship between the audience and the piece, right? Be in terms of, or not just in terms of thematics, but really thinking about the relational aspect of where the body is in space. Maybe in terms of the expanded cinema aspect of it, is that something that you can share about how conceptually it came, like how everything is being mapped out for you?
Right. I think, of course, right from the start, the idea was that let's do something that is not just on a flat, two-dimensional, conventional cinema, as much as I am still, of course, a filmmaker myself, and I work through such a medium. But I think when Roger first came to me, we were trying to push ourselves with the idea of like, how do we, well, also to really take this into context, it is in some response to the pandemic, right? It's like everyone is very stuck at home, right? Everyone is no longer understanding how the relationship with our own bodies has started to change so much, you know. So aside from what can we do that is just on the flat screen, immersing ourselves onto this flat screen, but for me it's slightly disembodied, you know. Yeah. So I think how now I have taken to task an idea of like, yeah, what if we really do this as a live experience, but in a meaningful way for me, I guess. Yeah. Because when then of course I started to talk about this idea of an expanded cinema, because already there is, we know that Eugene is on board and we are going to do a live music, and that's very exciting for us. I mean, to listen to a music live is something that is really precious and really amazing for me, because also every performance will be different, right? It's not like we recorded something and it will be exactly coming on point and here. Yeah. So from even myself, you know, I'm super excited because I have heard the music, but I have not heard it also live, right? I've heard pieces of it, I've heard samples of it, I've heard how it's put together here and there. But for me, I am going to be my own audience for the first time also, when the orchestra really comes and puts everything together with the work, you know? So this idea of being in body, in space, experiencing the work, for me, this is something that I'm trying to say, we've of course been doing this with stage and theater, but how do we do this with cinema also in a meaningful way, right? as a filmmaker myself. And so I was trying to play around with the idea of first breaking up the single screen into three, right? Yeah, maybe some people don't know yet, but yeah, this film is in a way three films, or three concurrent films. And I started to play around with the idea of different perspectives and aspects, right? We are seeing the same scene or the same moment of the film, but sort of through three different angles or perspectives. It's very strange. It's like I was discussing with my cinematographer. It's like, oh, we're making a bit of like a cubist film, you know. It's like, yeah, you get to see it from one angle, but you're seeing three. It breaks apart the body, you know. We've always understood the body, but we've always only understood the body from a singular perspective, because that's how we see and relate to a body. As much as the body is three-dimensional, we only understand the body as three-dimensional conceptually, you know, in some strange way, because we're always seeing it only from our one perspective, right? So here I'm trying to, yeah, I think this is something that me and my cinematographer, we talked a lot about. Yeah, now we have three screens. Of course, we've always also been trying out with ideas to like juxtapose things together, or, you know, to create more meanings by placing them together. But, you know, can we also play around with aspects, with perspectives, you know, with trying to defragment certain realities, you know, in that sense. And so during the shooting, that was what we were thinking a lot about, right? But I myself also know that there is something else I wanted to really do as an expanded cinema, you know, not just to break it up into multiple screens, but at the same time, how do I interact live with the image? And so we brought in the ideas of this kind of high precision lasers, where it will be projected onto the screen. Yeah, so for me, the lasers in the work that I'm designing with my collaborator Flex, and so we are using the laser component as a little bit like a narrator, you know, to the film. You know, the laser represents the premise that humans have sort of uploaded ourselves into a singular consciousness. Right? This is sort of the starting premise of the work. It's a slightly speculative science fiction premise, but yeah. But I wanted that presence of this singular consciousness to be constantly engaging with the film. And when you see the film is actually our memories. So the film is the past, you know, the laser is that present that, for me, interacts through its certain geometric and abstracted shapes and forms on the image itself. And so the way we shot the film was also for that purpose. The way we framed the scenario and the scenes, yeah, was to be done for the laser to interact with. So I think as an audience experiencing this work, it is a very full-bodied experience, to put it this way, because that liveness, if I can put it this way, that physicality, it's not a passive, you know, yeah, that is how we are always interacting with our content these days on a computer screen. But it's something that sort of comes back at you, right? And you are now put into the space in a very present way. Yeah.
I'm thinking about what was earlier said about the idea of the voyage, right? And it does sound like the audience is really invited to travel along with the piece, in a way, make their own decisions and make their own meanings from looking at the different perspectives that that will be offered, and that feels in a way deeply theatrical, in the sense that as a theatre practitioner, sometimes I feel what I love about theatre is that everyone watches the same thing, and yet they are not watching the same thing, right? Or they're not experiencing the same thing, because we each have our own histories and baggages, like Eugene, you were talking about, that we just can't run from. And because of that, what we look out for within something that we're seeing is very much guided by our own lenses and, in a way, preferences. And sometimes with film, it does feel like it's a bit more directed, right? We're seeing what the director wants us to see. We're focusing in on the details, or paying attention to what the director wants us to focus on. And somehow it sounds like in this expanded cinema experience, there is a shifting away from the very singular directed approach to one where, yeah, there's really the kind of fragment or the mosaic or the kind of collage experience where everything perhaps comes together only at the end of the experience, where you're like, okay, I can see how one thing relates to the other.
On this point, actually, I should also mention that there is also Anandi, our singer, performer. Yeah. So she also appears on stage live, and interacting also with all the elements that are going on, right? Because there's the laser that not only interacts with the film that is projected on screen, but also the laser that would create a physical light structure that also sort of dances or choreographs with her. And of course, she embodies a very physical part of the music. Physical meaning she is the voice, her instrument of flesh, in that sense, from her vocals, that would resonate with the whole film. And then she becomes, if the laser is a certain kind of abstract narrator, she is the textual element to presenting the work. And she actually talking about trying to create a sense of that it is not just the director directing. I think maybe I can mention that this work is deeply collaborative, in the sense that we are really letting all the different components have its own voice and space, and a lot of freedom to really come together and jam with the piece, So, like Eugene would be able to explain that, like, I think I left him a lot of room to really, bring him and the composition and the orchestra into the work. Because, for example, I had shot the film with a minimal dialogue, right? And this would allow him that space to really bring his voice into that work, Just as well, we're making a lot of room for Anandi, our performer, to really bring her own voice into this work. Her singing style and the way that she uses her musicality, I think, has a lot of that. It's not spontaneous, but it's very improvised, and it's very not so strictly written in, as Eugene, you could explain. Yeah.
So she comes from a tradition, obviously, of which is sort of it's not spontaneous, but it is improvisational, because Hindustani singing is sort of, it's based on like thousands of years of tradition, but there's a spontaneity that every performance can go in so many different directions. And I think this is, again, I remember one of the very first calls we had together, where we were talking about this idea of feedback loops between the characters, or the sort of the components of this work, and the film and the audience as well. And so this idea of improvisation, somehow, that in the moment there is something happening that nobody really controls, somehow, that it's so human in that sense. That it's not imposed, and so much of performance is kind of crafted in a perfect way because we want everything to be exactly right. And so Anandi's part, which is really something I've never done before, and I think it's an interesting kind of journey as well for working with her, is partly it's quite specific because she has to be in certain places and it has to match with the harmonies of the orchestra. It has to match with the tone of the film in a way. But then there's a lot of space for her to kind of then make it her own. And it will always be different from day to day, I think, and from performance to performance. And that really depends on her own connection and sort of embodiment of the whole thing. Because actually, like, once you're there out on stage alone in the dark, it's the most sort of intimate, artistically intimate moment, because somehow then you're confronted with what am I going to sing? And of course, that's a moment that happens, it's infinitesimally like short, but it is a moment. And I think that aspect of her as an artist and of this whole kind of project, that at the end it comes down to this very personal expression, grounded in something that obviously has taken a couple of years to put together. I think it gives the work something very alive that will always be there, that it's never really finished somehow.
Yeah, I think Anandi is such an incredible vocalist. When we were speaking, I was just so drawn to the kind of transcendental quality of her vocals, and yet the very warm and very alive presence that you can see in her as a performer. But I guess maybe as a question to slowly wrap up, in thinking about the work that is never really finished, I'm aware that, the Once and Future does have a module called Project Labyrinth that will be presented later this year. And I was wondering if both of you could share a little bit about how that's going to, how that sits with the Once and Future.
Sure. Charlotte, Chris, you? Okay, I'll just briefly sort of introduce it, and then Chris can speak more about actually, we presented this last October 2021 in Hong Kong. Partly the reason was that we needed the New Vision Arts Festival wanted a kind of an online work or something that we could present, in the context of the pandemic, in a way that now so many things have online components. And these can vary. I mean, these become all kinds of things, from like VR to kind of making of and back, stage kind of things. And so we I think all agreed that we wanted to do something that was really not just some online version of this work, also because we didn't have an offline version of the work. So that sort of prevented us from having an online version of the work, but it gave us a chance to kind of think also a little bit, at least from my perspective, about how what this category of work could mean in the future. That it's not just an extra sort of side thing to a project, but could give more meaning and nuance to whatever we see on stage or in reality, so that actually it's not something that's kind of a secondary thing. And again, I think with that prompt, Chris really created something very special with our art director, Xavier, who's a French sort of director / designer, that I think gives a lot of insight into the Once and Future without actually really giving up anything of the project. And that's what was really interesting. I mean, we use the same music from the film, sort of, but it's very sort of, because it's so decontextualized from the film. When it appears in the Once and Future, it won't feel at all the same as how it appeared in Project Labyrinth. And again, that's something quite interesting. Yeah.
Well, I actually, Eugene basically said everything I wanted to say, so I try not to repeat. But I could just touch a little bit about maybe it was fun for me also that that as a filmmaker, you bring a certain story into it, and then you realize, I wish I had a little bit more time to explain something, to bring some, because, for example, I think what we really wanted for the Once and Future was that we wanted to really get straight into it, so already there was that starting premise of that science fiction premise of a planetary exodus, and sort of what we are leaving behind, so that we can really get straight into it, But then for me, sometimes I think, maybe, it would be good if we can do a prequel of some sort, to really explore that idea. How did we end up wanting to do, what was the process to which this happened? And so I think when we had this opportunity to do Project Labyrinth, although we were thinking, okay, we're gonna do it in a totally digital way, online, what does that allow us, right? How does that open things up for us? As much as we have been talking about the amazing aspect of that live, being live and experiencing the physical work, but at the same time, doing it digitally and online opens up also, as we know, right, already a whole slew of technologies that we can really utilize. Now, I guess that's us trying to open up on both sides, right? To say, okay, we have certain interactivities, that we can also create a much more active, not so passive kind of viewing experience. And how do we create digital tech interactivities with our audiences to make them part of this premise? Because as it is, of course, obviously about us, this work, about humans, about us finally, engaging with our climate, with our planet, even if there is that idea that, if it doesn't work, we might have to leave, we might have to go extinct, this is something that we are all confronting, It's not so far in the future. And I think using this interactivity to bring that audience one step closer into this premise is, for us, very exciting. How we can utilize these technologies we have at hand.
I love how, I think the Once and Future is such a rich project that I can see how there would be, offshoots or prequels, sequels, part 2, I don't know.
Merchandising.
Yes, at some point, everyone's going to be like, here is the next product of the future. And I think at the same time, what strikes me from our conversation today is that, in the Once and Future, and I think in both of your works, even as you are trying to address oftentimes broader, larger, maybe a bit more abstract societal questions, thinking about the environment or thinking about the migrant workforce, that there's always a deeply personal and intimate quality to the work that I think is quite special. I wish we had so much more time to really dive into the symbolisms of the work, because I feel like there's so much detail and thought that went into really thinking about how one thing connects to the other in order to create that kind of coherency, right? Even as there are multiple worlds being presented to the audience. But I guess maybe in a part 2 conversation, in the same way as the Once and Future, will continue to live many afterlives. I hope that, there will also be other chances for conversation about this incredibly evocative piece. So thank you again for today, and all the best with preparations for the show. Thank you and take care.
Thank you, Maki.